There's a curious thing about people who discover profound spiritual teachings. The first reaction is almost always to try to apply everything at once with the precision of someone who has just found the secret formula for existence. It's as if each new concept is a magical tool that will finally solve all the problems of the human condition. Some people in different times and places reached the same revolutionary conclusion, that the Buddhist teachings on detachment, compassion, and non-action were exactly what they needed to transcend the mundane limitations of existence, that they could finally live according to pure spiritual principles without being contaminated by the crude demands of society. Each of these people was technically correct about the Buddhist principles they studied, and each discovered that applying these principles without considering social context produces results that the Illuminado probably would not approve of. Because it turns out that authentic wisdom includes an inconvenient characteristic. It needs to work in the real world. In the next almost 2 hours, we will discover how very well-intentioned people learned this lesson in the hardest way possible. If you like stories that reveal how good spiritual intentions can create social chaos like this video, if you want more discoveries about how real wisdom balances idealism with practical responsibility, subscribe to the channel. Hug your pet, get comfortable, and let's begin. Maestre Hiroshi had the kind of career that other magistrates envied, 30 years presiding over the Imperial Court of Kyoto, an impeccable reputation for complex cases, the absolute trust of the emperor to resolve disputes that other judges considered impossible, until someone gave him a book about Buddhist compassion. The book explained karuna, universal compassion, the ability to feel the suffering of all living beings and actively work to alleviate it. The author described how this compassion made no distinctions. It did not separate criminals from victims, rich from poor, guilty from innocent. Everyone deserved the same loving care from a truly awakened heart. Sensei Hiroshi read this and had a revelation that would change his life and almost destroy the Japanese judicial system, because the next morning he arrived at the court with a new revolutionary philosophy. If universal compassion was the essence of Buddhist wisdom, then obviously his role as a judge was to demonstrate this compassion in every decision. No more harsh punishments, no more sentences that perpetuated suffering, just pure, unlimited mercy. The first opportunity to apply this new wisdom appeared before noon. A merchant had been caught stealing rice from temples during a time of scarcity. The crime was clear, the evidence irrefutable. The traditional penalty would be prison and triple restitution of the stolen value. But Sensei Hiroshi looked at the man trembling before him and saw only a suffering being who needed compassion. "You stole because your family was hungry," Sensei Hiroshi said, with the gentle voice of someone who had discovered a profound truth. "The suffering that caused this theft is punishment enough. You are free to go." The merchant left, confused but relieved. The court assistants exchanged uneasy glances. The monks who had been robbed were perplexed by the decision, but Sensei Hiroshi was radiant. He had applied genuine compassion instead of cruel justice. He felt closer to enlightenment than ever before. The second case arrived 2 hours later. A samurai had assaulted a peasant who had allegedly looked at him disrespectfully. The peasant had a broken arm and serious head injuries. The samurai admitted the crime but claimed he was defending his honor. The law was clear about unprovoked assault, especially against defenseless peasants. Sensei Hiroshi looked at the samurai. He saw another suffering being, a man trapped in rigid concepts of honor and status that made him cause pain to others. Clearly, this samurai needed compassion, not punishment. "You acted out of ignorance of your true nature," said Sensei Hiroshi. "Punishing ignorance with more suffering only perpetuates the cycle. You are forgiven. May this experience teach you about the futility of violence." The samurai left even more confused than the merchant. The injured peasant left outraged. The other magistrates began to whisper among themselves. But Sensei Hiroshi was convinced he had discovered the secret of true justice. Universal compassion applied without exception. It was revolutionary. It was Buddhist. It was obviously correct. In the third case, a public official had been caught embezzling funds intended for bridge maintenance. Several important bridges were crumbling because the money had been used for gambling. Travelers' lives were at risk. Sensei Hiroshi looked at the official and applied the same compassionate logic. Your gambling addiction is a form of suffering. What exactly does punishing suffering with more suffering solve? Nothing. You are forgiven. May this inspire you to seek help for your addiction. In the fourth case, someone had forged imperial documents to avoid taxes. In the fifth, a group had been caught selling fake medicines to seriously ill patients. In the sixth, a merchant was adulterating food that caused poisoning in dozens of people. Sensei Hiroshi forgave them all, with growing compassion, with absolute certainty that he was applying authentic Buddhist wisdom. At the end of the first day of his new approach, he returned home satisfied. He had transformed a court of punishment into a center of compassionate healing. No additional suffering had been created, only universal forgiveness and unconditional love. The next morning, he discovered that the news of his unlimited mercy had spread through the city like wildfire. The line of cases at the courthouse was 3 times longer than usual. The line of criminals awaiting judgment stretched for 3 blocks. There were thieves, assailants, fraudsters, smugglers, and some types of criminals Sensei Hiroshi had never seen before. They had all heard about the judge who forgave any crime in the name of Buddhist compassion. Sensei Hiroshi looked at the crowd and felt his heart expand with universal love. All those suffering beings were coming to seek relief from their pain. He would be the instrument of infinite mercy. The first case was a man who had stolen horses, not 1 horse. Horses, 15 of them to be exact. The man explained that he needed the horses to sell and buy food for his family of 12 children. 12 children is a great responsibility, said Sensei Hiroshi with genuine compassion. You acted out of paternal love, not greed. This is not a crime, it is devotion. You are forgiven. The man left, radiant. The 15 horses remained at an unknown location. The second case was a woman who had broken into 3 different houses during the summer festival. She stole jewelry, money, and valuables. When questioned, she explained that her own house had burned down and she needed money to rebuild it. Losing your home is a terrible tragedy, said Sensei Hiroshi. You were not stealing. You were seeking to rebuild your life. Your motivation was pure. You are forgiven. The woman thanked him profusely and left. The families who had been robbed watched in awkward silence. In the third case, a group of men had broken into a rice warehouse during the night. They took enough sacks to feed an entire village. When confronted, they explained that they were distributing food to the poor. You are modern benfeitores, said Sensei Hiroshi with tears in his eyes. You sacrificed your own safety to feed the hungry. This is not a crime. It is compassionate action. You are all forgiven. The men left celebrating. The owner of the warehouse timidly asked who was going to pay for the stolen rice. Compassion cannot be measured in coins, Sensei Hiroshi replied serenely. By noon, Sensei Hiroshi had forgiven 2 cases of arson, 1 case of currency counterfeiting, 3 cases of silk smuggling, 1 case of assault that left 2 people hospitalized, and a peculiar case involving a man who was selling elixirs of youth that were basically sugar water at astronomical prices. Each criminal received a compassionate explanation of how their crimes were actually manifestations of internal suffering or misguided attempts to solve legitimate problems. Each was forgiven with universal love. Each left free to continue their life. The news spread even faster on the second day. The next morning, the line of criminals wrapped around the block. There were people who had traveled from other provinces to be judged by the compassionate judge, merchants who had committed elaborate fraud, samurai who had killed people in illegal duels, officials who had stolen staggering amounts from the public coffers. They all had moving stories. They all had emotional justifications. They were all forgiven with the same unlimited compassion. Sensei Hiroshi was in spiritual paradise. He had never felt so close to Illuminado nature. He was literally saving beings from suffering through unconditional forgiveness. It was exactly what the Buddhist texts prescribed. The other magistrates tried to talk to him during lunch on the third day. Sensei Hiroshi, said his oldest colleague carefully, perhaps we should consider that compassion and justice can work together, not in opposition. Justice without compassion is cruelty, Sensei Hiroshi replied. I am applying pure Dharma, without compromises to cruel social conventions. But people are starting to commit crimes specifically to be judged by you, insisted another. Magistrate. Yesterday, a man stole a cart just to experience universal forgiveness. Then my compassion is even curing criminal motivation, Sensei Hiroshi said triumphantly. If people come seeking forgiveness, it's because they recognize their need for spiritual healing. The other magistrates exchanged worried glances. On the afternoon of the third day, a merchant came to the court to report that his shop had been robbed. Again, for the 5th time that week. Always by the same men, who had already been forgiven on previous days. They come back every morning to steal more things, the desperate merchant explained. They say you forgive anything in the name of compassion. Sensei Hiroshi looked at the merchant with deep compassion. You are attached to material possessions, he said gently. Perhaps these robberies are opportunities to practice non-attachment. The universe is offering lessons on impermanence through these enlightened men. The merchant left in a state of shock. Sensei Hiroshi returned home that night more convinced than ever that he had discovered the perfect application of Buddhism in the real world. On the 4th morning of Sensei Hiroshi's experiment with universal compassion, 3 things happened simultaneously that perhaps should have served as warning signs. First, the line of criminals now started at the gate of the Imperial Palace and stretched to the Central Market. Second, 2 merchants had closed their shops because they were being robbed more often than they could restock. Third, a group of criminals had set up a sort of permanent camp near the courthouse, operating what could only be described as a rotating scheme of crimes and pardons. Sensei Hiroshi observed all this and saw only evidence that his approach was working perfectly. Look how my compassion has attracted so many suffering beings, he told the court assistants. It's as if I have created a spiritual healing center. The assistants looked at the crowd of professional criminals drinking sake and planning their next robbery, and had difficulty seeing any evidence of spiritual healing. The first case of the day was presented by a man who had developed a particularly creative approach to the new judicial order. He had robbed a house, sold everything he stole, used the money to buy a bigger house, rented rooms in that house to other criminals, and was now using the rental profits to finance even bigger robberies. Your Honor, the man said respectfully, I would like to confess my crimes and receive forgiveness. Tell me about your suffering, Sensei Hiroshi said with genuine interest. Well, I suffer from a lack of money, and this suffering led me to make desperate decisions. But now I understand that I can come here every week, confess my crimes, receive forgiveness, and continue to alleviate my financial suffering without negative consequences. Sensei Hiroshi was moved by the man's honesty. You have developed a deep understanding of the cyclical nature of suffering, he said. You are forgiven, and I admire your courage to seek regular spiritual healing. The man thanked him and scheduled an appointment for the following week. The second case was even more innovative. A woman had created what she called a crime-on-demand service. People came to her with problems that required criminal solutions. She executed the necessary crimes, then came to court to confess and receive forgiveness. Her clients kept the results of the crimes. She kept the payment and the spiritual absolution. It's a perfect system, she explained to Sensei Hiroshi. I take on all the negative karma from the crimes, but then your honor cleanses my karma with compassionate forgiveness. Everybody wins. Sensei Hiroshi was impressed by the theological sophistication of the operation. You are practicing an advanced form of bodhisattva, he said, taking on the suffering of others for yourself. This is pure altruism. You are forgiven, obviously. The woman left to attend to a client list that stretched for 2 pages. In the third case, a group of men had developed what they called educational crimes. They would break into houses, but instead of stealing things, they would leave little lessons on material non-attachment. They would steal money, but leave Buddhist texts explaining why material wealth is illusory. They would assault people, but attach explanations on how physical suffering teaches important spiritual lessons. You are teachers using unconventional methods, Sensei Hiroshi said, with tears of admiration. You are spreading the Dharma through direct action, This is genius, forgiven and encouraged to continue your missionary work. The men left to plan their next lesson on impermanence, involving setting a few houses on fire. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the situation was developing in directions that future economists would call systemic collapse induced by perverse incentives. The criminals had discovered that they could commit increasingly larger crimes without consequences. This created a kind of criminal inflation. Why steal a chicken when you could steal an entire farm? Why counterfeit a few coins when you could forge the entire province's currency? Merchants were leaving the city. Public officials were resigning. Entire families were moving to regions with more traditional judicial systems. But the most surprising aspect of the situation was that some of the criminals were actually having genuine spiritual experiences. One thief had started meditating between robberies. A fraudster was studying Buddhist texts to improve his confessions. Several assailants had developed gratitude practices for the opportunity to explore the nature of suffering through systematic violence. It was as if Sensei Hiroshi had accidentally created a monastery where the vows included regular crime. On the morning of the second week, Sensei Hiroshi arrived at the court and found something he did not expect. The emperor was sitting in his chair. It was not a courtesy visit. "Sensei Hiroshi," said the emperor, in the voice he used when he was trying not to behead someone immediately, "can you explain to me why my capital has become the preferred tourist destination for criminals from all over Japan?" Sensei Hiroshi felt a wave of pride. His fame had reached the emperor. "Your Majesty, I am applying authentic Buddhist compassion to the judicial system. I am healing suffering at its source instead of perpetuating it through cruel punishments." "Healing suffering," the emperor repeated slowly. "Interesting. And can you explain to me why the imperial coffers have been robbed 3 times this week by the same men, whom you forgave 3 times? They are trapped in karmic patterns of material need," Sensei Hiroshi explained patiently. "Every time I forgive them, I plant seeds of compassion that will eventually blossom into spiritual awakening." "Eventually," said the emperor. "And while we wait for these seeds to blossom, should I accept that my treasury is being redistributed to criminals in the name of spiritual growth?" "Your Majesty is demonstrating attachment to material wealth," Sensei Hiroshi said gently. "Perhaps these robberies are opportunities to practice involuntary generosity." The emperor was quiet for a moment. His advisors stepped back slightly. "Sensei Hiroshi," the emperor finally said, "you will judge the next cases normally. I will observe, and I will take notes on the results of your compassionate methodology." The first case was familiar. The man from the rotating crime scheme was back. This time he had stolen the city's main temple, not just the offering money, the entire temple. He had dismantled the building piece by piece and sold the wood, the statues, and even the garden stones. "As always, I come to confess and seek forgiveness," the man said cheerfully. Sensei Hiroshi looked at the emperor, then at the man. "Tell me about your suffering," he said, following his usual formula. "Well, I suffer from a lack of adequate housing, so I use the temple wood to build a house. I suffer from a lack of spiritual decoration at home, so I use the statues. I suffer from a lack of a Zen garden, so I use the stones." It was a very efficient solution for multiple types of suffering. "And the monks who lost their temple?" asked the emperor. "They now have an excellent opportunity to practice non-attachment to sacred places," the man explained. "I am offering free spiritual education." Sensei Hiroshi felt the emperor's gaze like 2 katanas pointed at his throat. "You are forgiven," Sensei Hiroshi said, but with less conviction than usual. The second case was a woman who had taken control of the entire rice production of the province, not through purchase or negotiation, through systematic theft of every grain planted by every farmer in the region. "I suffer from concern about widespread hunger," she explained, "so I centralized all rice production to ensure efficient distribution." "And how are you distributing this rice?" asked the emperor. "By selling it at prices that reflect its true scarcity in the market," she replied. "It's basic economics." "You are artificially creating the famine you claim to be preventing," the emperor observed. His Majesty is applying linear logic to a complex spiritual problem, Sensei Hiroshi said quickly. This woman is creating opportunities for the entire province to practice non-attachment to food security. The Emperor made a note on his scroll. The note seemed to involve drawings of swords. The third case arrived accompanied by a crowd of furious victims. A group of men had developed an operation where they burned down houses at night, then showed up in the morning, offering reconstruction services at inflated prices. Using wood they had stolen from other houses they planned to burn the following night. "We suffer from unemployment," explained the group's leader, "and we realized we could create our own job opportunities through strategic arson." "You are destroying the city," said one of the victims. "We are offering lessons on impermanence on a large scale," the leader corrected, "and employment opportunities." Sensei Hiroshi looked at the Emperor. The Emperor was writing furiously on his scroll. "Your Majesty," Sensei Hiroshi said carefully, "I can explain how this fits into the Buddhist philosophy of—" "Silence," said the Emperor. "I have a simple question. In 2 weeks of universal compassion, how many crimes have been prevented?" Sensei Hiroshi thought carefully. "Technically none, but many opportunities for spiritual growth have been created. And how many crimes were committed specifically because the criminals knew they would be forgiven?" Sensei Hiroshi looked at the line of criminals stretching to the horizon. "Well, most of them." The Emperor stopped writing and looked directly at Sensei Hiroshi. "Time for a lesson on cause and effect," he said. The Emperor ordered everyone out of the courtroom except Sensei Hiroshi. The line of criminals waiting for forgiveness dispersed with the speed of pigeons when someone claps. In 5 minutes, the courtroom was empty for the first time in 2 weeks. "Sit down," said the Emperor. Sensei Hiroshi sat. "I'm going to tell you a story," said the Emperor, "about a monk I knew when I was young. He had spent 20 years studying Buddhist compassion. He knew all the sutras. He could recite texts on karuna from memory. He was considered an expert on universal love. Sensei Hiroshi prepared himself for a lesson on how he was correctly applying Buddhist teachings. One day, this monk saw a mother hitting her child in the street. The boy had stolen food from a merchant. The mother was furious and ashamed. The monk approached and told the mother she should forgive the boy, that hitting him would only create more suffering, that compassion meant accepting the child's behavior without judgment. The Emperor paused and looked at Sensei Hiroshi. The mother stopped hitting the boy. The monk felt holy. The next day, the boy stole again, and again, and again. Within a month, he was leading a group of child thieves. Within 6 months, he had become an adult criminal specializing in robbing from poor families. Sensei Hiroshi began to feel an uncomfortable sensation in his stomach. The monk continued to preach universal forgiveness, until the day the same boy, now a man, robbed and killed an entire family, including a child the same age he was when he started stealing food. The Emperor stood up and walked to the window. The monk came to see me that day. He was broken. He said he had spent 20 years studying compassion, but perhaps he had never understood what it really meant. "And what did he discover?" Sensei Hiroshi asked in a small voice. "That true compassion sometimes means letting people face the consequences of their actions. That genuine love for a person includes protecting other people from that person when necessary. That authentic karuna considers the well-being of the entire community, not just the immediate comfort of the individual who caused harm." The Emperor turned to face Sensei Hiroshi. "You have spent 2 weeks creating suffering in the name of alleviating it. You have destroyed the safety of innocent people in the name of compassion for criminals. You have encouraged more crime through forgiveness that should discourage crime." Sensei Hiroshi felt as if he were seeing his own reflection for the first time in weeks. "But the Buddhist texts speak of universal compassion," he said weakly. "Yes, and they also speak of skillful means, upaya, the wisdom of applying compassion in ways that actually help, not just in ways that make us feel compassionate." The Emperor returned to his chair. "Compassion for criminals is important, but compassion for the victims is also important. Compassion for the merchants who are being robbed is important. Compassion for the families who are losing their homes is important. Compassion for yourself as a judge who needs to make difficult decisions is also important. Sensei Hiroshi began to understand that he had confused feeling compassionate with being effectively compassionate. True compassion, the emperor continued, sometimes means giving people consequences that teach them to stop causing suffering to others. Sometimes it means protecting the community from individuals who repeatedly choose to cause harm. Sometimes it means being firm, because firmness is what someone needs to grow. So, I was wrong about everything? Asked Sensei Hiroshi. You were right about the importance of compassion, wrong about how to apply it. Compassion without wisdom about context and consequences is not compassion. It's enabling. The emperor picked up a book he had brought. This book talks about the middle way. Neither extreme asceticism nor extreme indulgence, neither cruelty nor permissiveness, finding the balance that truly serves the well-being of all. Sensei Hiroshi looked at the book as if he were seeing Buddhist literature for the first time. Starting tomorrow, said the emperor, you will go back to judging cases normally, but you will consider compassion for all parties involved, not just for those who committed crimes. You will ask what kind of response truly reduces suffering in the long term, not just in the immediate moment. And if I make mistakes again? You will make mistakes again. We all do. The difference is learning from mistakes instead of repeating the same mistakes with more intensity. Sensei Hiroshi spent the rest of the afternoon reading about the middle way, about how wisdom and compassion need to work together, about how skillful means adapting the response to the context, not applying the same response to all situations. The next morning, he returned to the court with a different understanding of karuna, one that included protection, appropriate boundaries, and yes, sometimes consequences that help people learn. The line of criminals had disappeared overnight. Apparently, guaranteed forgiveness was the only thing that kept the business profitable. Sensei Hiroshi smiled. Perhaps that was the first real lesson about compassion he had learned, and while Sensei Hiroshi was finally discovering that limitless compassion can be cruelty disguised as wisdom, on the other side of the sea, a completely different spiritual dilemma was about to reveal another inconvenient facet of Dharma applied to the real world. Because it turns out that every era produces people convinced they have discovered how to apply Buddhist teachings in a revolutionary way to practical life. And every era demonstrates, with mathematical precision, that good spiritual intentions can create results that the Illuminado probably did not include in his original plans. In Seoul, a merchant was about to discover that total non-attachment to financial results, when applied to a business that supports entire families, produces a very quick education on the difference between personal enlightenment and social responsibility. Let's meet her. Kim Soo-jin had inherited the family textile business at a time when trade between Korea and China was the most profitable in history. 3 generations of knowledge about silk, cotton, and wool. Business relationships that dated back to when her grandfather was still learning to walk. A reputation for honesty that made Chinese merchants travel specifically to negotiate with her family. In other words, she had inherited a money-making machine that ran itself, until she started reading about Buddhist non-attachment. The book explained that suffering comes from attachment to results, that true wisdom means doing what needs to be done without caring about personal gains or losses. That enlightened people act without expectations, work without obsession for profit, and find peace through complete indifference to material successes or failures. Soo-jin read this and had a revelation that would change her life and almost destroy 3 generations of family work. The next morning, she woke up with a new, revolutionary business philosophy. If attachment to profits was the root of commercial suffering, then obviously the key to happiness was to conduct business without caring about financial results. No more anxiety about profit margins, no more stress about competition, just pure detached action. The first opportunity to apply this new wisdom appeared before breakfast. A Chinese merchant arrived, interested in buying all the silk she had in stock. It was the kind of deal that kept the family comfortable for 6 months. The merchant offered a price that was exactly half the market value of the silk. Traditionally, Soo-jin would have negotiated, explained the real value of the merchandise, found a fair price for both parties. But she looked at the merchant and saw an opportunity to practice total non-attachment. "I accept your price," Sujin said with the serenity of someone who has discovered a profound truth. Attachment to profits only creates suffering. The merchant was confused but didn't argue. He had prepared for hours of negotiation and ended up leaving with premium quality silk for the price of defective scraps. Sujin felt radiant. She had applied authentic non-attachment instead of cruel greed. She was closer to enlightenment than ever before. The second opportunity arrived that same afternoon. A family needed fabric for winter clothes but had little money. Traditionally, Sujin would have offered a reasonable discount or a payment plan, but she looked at the family and saw another chance to practice non-attachment to financial results. "Take everything you need without paying anything," Sujin said. "Money is just an illusion. True wealth comes from detached generosity." The family left laden with expensive fabrics, bewildered but grateful. Sujin felt even more enlightened. In the third deal, a local merchant tried to sell her inferior quality wool for the price of premium wool. Traditionally, Sujin would have rejected the offer or negotiated a fair price for the actual quality, but she applied the same detached logic. "Quality is just perception," Sujin said. "I accept your wool for the price you're asking. I don't care if it's inferior." In the fourth deal, someone offered to buy cotton that cost 10 coins for 5 coins. In the fifth, a family asked to borrow expensive fabrics, promising to pay when they could. In the sixth, a merchant sold her cotton dyed with colors that faded in the first wash. Sujin accepted everything, with growing non-attachment, with absolute certainty that she was applying authentic Buddhist wisdom. At the end of the first week of her new approach, she returned home satisfied. She had transformed a for-profit business into a center of detached generosity. No anxiety about money had been created, only universal, giving and enlightened indifference to material results. The next morning, she discovered that her approach had created some unexpected results. First, all the merchants in the region now knew that she accepted any price for anything. Second, all the merchants with inferior quality goods came specifically to negotiate with her. Third, all the families who wanted free fabric had started lining up at her shop door before dawn. Sujin looked at the line of people waiting to receive free fabric or sell overpriced merchandise, and saw only evidence that her philosophy was attracting people who needed spiritual help. "I am creating opportunities for the entire community to practice non-attachment to material values," she told her husband, who was looking at the accounting books with an expression of growing panic. "Sujin," her husband said carefully, "perhaps we should talk about how non-attachment and family responsibility can work together." "Family responsibility is just another form of attachment," Sujin replied serenely. "I am freeing our family from the prison of financial security." In the second week of Sujin's experiment with total non-attachment, 3 simultaneous developments created what future economic scholars would call an unsustainable business model based on misapplied spiritual principles. First, she had given away so much free fabric that her stock was practically empty. Second, she had bought so much inferior quality merchandise at premium prices that the family's money was almost gone. Third, she had developed a reputation that exclusively attracted people interested in exploiting her new philosophy of unlimited generosity. Sujin observed all this and saw only evidence that she was completely transcending the limitations of conventional business thinking. "Look how my non-attachment has created spiritual abundance," she said to her husband and 2 children during a meal that consisted of plain rice because there was no money for anything else. "We are living like true Buddhist practitioners." The husband looked at his children, who were clearly losing weight and had difficulty seeing abundance of any kind. "Sujin," he said carefully, "perhaps we can practice non-attachment in a way that doesn't involve our children starving." "Hunger is just a physical sensation," Sujin replied serenely. "I am teaching our children about impermanence through the direct experience of not having enough food." The first customer of the day was a woman who had developed a sophisticated understanding of Sujin's new business philosophy. She brought old rags she had dyed with mud and offered them as artisanal silk, for astronomical prices. These fabrics were created through deep meditation, the woman explained. Each thread was imbued with spiritual energy through hours of contemplation. Su Jin examined the mud-dyed rags and applied her detached logic. Quality is just conditioned perception. I accept your fabrics for the price you are asking. Attachment to material standards only creates suffering. The woman left with an amount that would normally buy authentic silk from China. Su Jin stored the dyed rags as if they were treasures. The second customer was even more innovative. He had heard about Su Jin's non-attached approach and brought a revolutionary business proposal. I would like to buy all your future stock for 1/10 of the market. Price, he said. Payment in advance, obviously. Future stock, Su Jin asked. Everything you buy in the next 6 months, I'll buy from you immediately for very low prices. It's a perfect system. You practice non-attachment to profits, I practice profits. Su Jin was impressed by the man's spiritual honesty. You are offering to help me practice non-attachment systematically. This is compassion in action. I accept your proposal. The man paid a ridiculously low amount and left with the rights to merchandise that didn't even exist yet. In the third deal, an entire family arrived with an approach they called compassionate commerce. They explained that they were too poor to buy fabrics, but they would be willing to accept free fabrics in exchange for prayers for Su Jin's spiritual prosperity. You are offering spiritual wealth in exchange for material wealth, Su Jin said with tears of admiration. This is an enlightened transaction. The family left loaded with the last quality fabrics in the stock. Meanwhile, in the Kim family home, the situation was developing in directions that future nutritionists would call malnutrition induced by misapplied philosophy. The children had begun to complain constantly of hunger. The husband had started working as a carpenter in his spare time to earn extra money for food. The neighbors were offering borrowed meals with increasing frequency. But the most disturbing aspect of the situation was that some of Su Jin's customers were genuinely worried about her. An old merchant came to visit her at the end of the second week. Su Jin, he said gently, you are being exploited by people who know you will accept any deal. Exploitation is just a perspective based on attachment to personal advantage, Su Jin replied. I am practicing pure generosity. But your family is in need, the merchant insisted. Need is an opportunity to develop non-attachment to material. Comfort, Su Jin explained. I am offering my family the chance to grow spiritually through the direct experience of not having enough. The merchant tried a different approach. What if I offered to buy your fabrics at fair prices? You can still practice non-attachment, but in a way that allows you to feed your children properly. Su Jin looked at him with compassion. You are attached to the idea that children need food in abundance, she said. I am teaching my children that true. Happiness does not depend on full bellies. The merchant left, shaking his head. That night, Su Jin's youngest son fainted during dinner. The fainting of Su Jin's youngest son created what traditional doctors would call a nutritional emergency, and what Su Jin initially interpreted as an advanced opportunity for bodily non-attachment. He is learning that the body is temporary, she explained to her husband as they carried the boy to bed. This experience will teach him about the illusory nature of attachment to regular meals. The husband looked at his unconscious son and experienced something that Buddhist philosophers would call a sudden awakening about the difference between spiritual theory and parental responsibility. Su Jin, he said in a voice he had never used before, our son fainted because he doesn't have enough food. This is not spiritual education, it's neglect. Neglect is just a concept based on attachment to social standards about nutrition, Su Jin replied, but with less conviction than usual. The next morning, 3 things happened simultaneously that began to crack Su Jin's philosophical system. First, her eldest daughter refused to get out of bed, claiming she was too weak to work in the shop. Second, a group of neighbors appeared at the door offering borrowed food with poorly disguised looks of concern. Third, the merchant who had bought the rights to her future stock showed up demanding goods she had no money to buy. Where are the fabrics you owe me? He asked. I couldn't buy fabrics because I used all the money to buy mud-dyed rags for the price of premium silk, Sujin explained. That's your problem. We have a deal. You owe me fabrics or you owe me money. Sujin looked at the man and tried to apply her philosophy of non-attachment. Debts are just concepts based on attachment to temporary agreements, she said. Debts are legal contracts, the man corrected. And I will use the legal system to collect what you owe me. It was the first time in 3 weeks that anyone had mentioned real consequences for her detached business approach. The first customer of the day was a woman who had heard about the Kim family's financial situation and came to offer a solution. She would buy the entire business for a fraction of its real value, allowing Sujin to practice the ultimate non-attachment to material possessions. It's the perfect opportunity to completely renounce the commercial life, the woman explained. You can dedicate yourself entirely to the spiritual path. Sujin looked around the shop her family had built over 3 generations. Then she looked at her children, who were visibly thinner than a month ago. And my family? She asked. Your family can live like monks, the woman said cheerfully. Depending on the charity of the community, it's very authentic. It was at that moment that something shifted in Sujin's mind. Maybe it was seeing her children clearly for the first time in weeks. Maybe it was hearing someone casually suggest she turn her entire family into spiritual beggars. Maybe it was simply the accumulation of 3 weeks of results that didn't seem very enlightened when viewed up close. No, she said slowly, I'm not selling the business. But that goes against your philosophy of non-attachment, the woman protested. Maybe my philosophy is wrong, Sujin said, and the words felt strange in her mouth. That afternoon she sent all the customers away and sat alone in the empty shop. For the first time in weeks she truly looked at the state of the business. Stock practically non-existent, money practically gone, family practically malnourished. She picked up the book on non-attachment that had inspired this whole experience and reread it carefully. On the second reading, she noticed sentences she had ignored the first time. Non-attachment does not mean indifference to the needs of others. The middle way avoids the extremes of both indulgence and deprivation. Right livelihood includes properly supporting those who depend on you. Apparently, total non-attachment to financial results was not exactly what the book was recommending. Sujin spent the rest of the afternoon doing calculations. How much money she had lost, how much stock she had wasted, how long it would take to rebuild what she had destroyed in 3 weeks of misapplied spirituality. When Tui, her husband, came home that night, he found Sujin sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by numbers and with an expression he hadn't seen in a long time. I've been thinking, she said, about the difference between wise non-attachment and irresponsibility disguised as spirituality. Her husband sat down beside her. And what's the difference? I'm still figuring it out, Sujin said, but I think it has something to do with taking care of the people who depend on you while you take care of your soul. The next morning, Sujin did something she hadn't done in 3 weeks. She put a sign on the shop door that said, "Closed for reorganization," and sat down to have an honest conversation with mathematics. The numbers were educational in a way that no Buddhist text had been. In 3 weeks she had lost the equivalent of 6 months of normal profit. She had given away fabrics worth 2 years of family savings. She had bought useless merchandise that cost more than the entire stock she had owned a month before. Even more revealing, she had created debts that would take at least a year to pay off, assuming she could return to the profit levels from before her experience with commercial enlightenment. This is an expensive education on the difference between non-attachment and self-destruction, she muttered as she added up increasingly depressing numbers. The first visitor of the day was the old merchant who had tried to warn her the week before. He brought a practical proposal. "Sujin," he said, "I can buy back some of the fabrics you sold for ridiculous prices. Not for the price you paid for them, but for what they're really worth. It's a way for you to recover at least part of what you lost." Sujin looked at him with a gratitude she hadn't felt in weeks. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because your family did honest business for 3 generations. A person shouldn't lose that because of a misunderstanding of Buddhist philosophy. A misunderstanding. You confused not caring about results with not being responsible for results. They are completely different things. The merchant explained how he had met Buddhist monks who managed temple businesses. They practiced non-attachment to personal gain, but were extremely careful with resources that sustained the monastic community. They understood that non-attachment means doing the best possible work without personal ego involved. It doesn't mean doing sloppy work and calling it spirituality. Su Jin spent the afternoon visiting people who had bought fabrics from her at absurdly low prices. She discovered something interesting. Half of them felt guilty for having taken advantage of her generosity and were willing to pay fairer prices retroactively. The other half had developed a philosophy where exploiting the naivety of others was a way of teaching lessons about material attachment. "You should thank me for accepting your fabrics at low prices," one of these people said. "I helped you practice non-attachment to profits." "You helped me practice the impoverishment of my family," Su Jin corrected. "Impoverishment is just a perception based on attachment to arbitrary standards of wealth," the person replied serenely. Su Jin discovered she had no patience for this kind of talk when her children were literally losing weight. "Give me back my fabrics or pay the fair price for them," she said. "That's not very Buddhist of you," the person said. "And is exploiting a mother trying to feed her children Buddhist?" Su Jin replied. The person was outraged at the suggestion that their exploitation was not spiritually motivated, but returned the fabrics. By the end of the day, Su Jin had recovered about half of what she had lost through ridiculous sales. It wasn't a full recovery, but it was enough to buy proper food for the family for a few weeks. That night, she cooked the first full meal the family had had in a week. As she watched her children eat with the appetite of people who had been starving, she had a different understanding of compassion. "I was so focused on practicing non-attachment that I forgot to practice care," she told her husband. "And what's the difference? Non-attachment means not letting ego and greed control your decisions. Care means making decisions that truly benefit the people who depend on you. I thought they were opposites, but maybe they need to work together." The husband, who had spent 3 weeks wondering if his wife had lost her sanity, smiled for the first time in a long time. "So how are you going to run the business now?" "I'm going to try to find the balance. Do fair business without obsessive anxiety about profit. Take care of the family without greed. Be generous when I can, but not when it harms people who depend on me." That sounds more complicated than total non-attachment. "It's more complicated," Su Jin agreed. "But apparently real wisdom is more complicated than simple formulas applied without thinking about the context." She looked at her children eating and felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't the spiritual pride of someone who had transcended material concerns. It was the simple satisfaction of a mother who was fulfilling her basic responsibilities. "Maybe this is a more important lesson about Buddhism than anything I read in that book," she said. 6 months after her experience with total non-attachment, Su Jin had developed what she secretly called practical business Buddhism. It was an approach that probably wouldn't be accepted in monasteries, but it worked surprisingly well for supporting a family through the textile trade. The first rule was simple: non-attachment to ego, not non-attachment to responsibility. This meant that she negotiated fair prices without personal anxiety about impressing other merchants, but also without indifference as to whether the prices adequately supported her family. It meant she could accept occasional losses without emotional drama, but not systematic losses that would harm people who depended on her. The second rule was even more practical: generosity within sustainable limits. She still helped families who needed fabrics but had little money. But now she carefully calculated how much she could donate without compromising her ability to care for her own children. It was planned generosity instead of impulsive generosity, disguised as spirituality. The third rule had emerged through painful experience. Spiritual wisdom does not replace practical knowledge. She still studied Buddhist texts, but now she also studied market trends, fabric quality, and negotiation techniques. She discovered that being a competent merchant was a form of compassion as much as being a spiritually developed person. The real test of the new approach came when the merchant who had bought the rights to her future stock returned to collect the remaining debts. "You still owe me fabrics worth 50 coins, he said. "True," Su Jin agreed. And I have a proposal. She offered to pay the debt through work. She would buy specific fabrics he needed, using her experience and relationships to get better prices than he could get on his own. He would pay the costs plus a fair margin, and the difference would be applied to the debt. It's a way to turn my mistake into a learning opportunity for both of us, she explained. The merchant was impressed by the maturity of the proposal and accepted. Over the following months, this collaboration became one of the most profitable aspects of Su Jin's business. She discovered she had a talent for finding rare fabrics at fair prices, and several merchants began to hire her as a consultant. Even more interesting, she discovered that this new approach drastically reduced her anxiety about money. When she was practicing total non-attachment, she spent the whole day worrying about how her indifference to profits was affecting her family. Now that she was being responsible about money, she rarely thought about it. It's as if financial worry comes from avoiding financial responsibility, not from having financial responsibility, she told her husband. One day, a young merchant came to visit her. The woman had heard about Su Jin's Buddhist experience and wanted advice on how to apply spirituality to business. I've read about non-attachment, the young woman said, and I'm thinking of stopping caring about profits to achieve inner peace. Su Jin looked at the woman and saw herself 6 months earlier. Can I ask you a question? Su Jin said. Do you have people who depend on you financially? I have 2 small children. Then let me tell you what I've learned about practical non-attachment. Su Jin explained the difference between non-attachment to anxiety about money and non-attachment to responsibility for money. She told her how she had confused indifference with wisdom, and how she had learned that taking good care of dependent people can be a more advanced spiritual practice than renouncing material concerns. The middle way doesn't mean avoiding extremes through indifference, she said. It means finding the balance point where you can fulfill your responsibilities without being dominated by greed or fear. But how do you know where that balance point is? By asking if your decisions are serving the real well-being of the people who depend on you, including yourself. If the answer is yes, you're probably on the right track. The young merchant thanked her and left with a very different understanding of practical spirituality. That night, Su Jin was closing the shop when she realized something that made her smile. All day, she had made decisions about prices, quality, and negotiations without a single wave of anxiety about money. She had been generous when possible, firm when necessary, and always careful. It wasn't the kind of dramatic transcendence she had imagined when she started studying non-attachment. It was something simpler and more sustainable. It was the ability to work competently without ego, care responsibly without obsession, and help others within limits that didn't harm her own family. Maybe this is what non-attachment really means, she told her husband that night. Not caring about personal ego, but caring deeply about real well-being. And what's the difference? Ego wants to impress people. Well-being wants to feed people. Apparently, the Illuminado knew the difference, even when I didn't. And while Su Jin was finally discovering that authentic non-attachment means caring better, not caring less, on the other side of the peninsula, an even more peculiar situation was developing in the halls of a traditional school. Because it turns out that every generation produces educators convinced they have discovered revolutionary teaching methods based on ancestral wisdom. And every generation learns through increasingly confused students that there are moments in pedagogical life when deep silence and effective communication are mutually exclusive concepts. In India, a teacher was about to conduct one of the most silently disastrous educational experiments in academic history. An experiment that would demonstrate, with mathematical precision, why the Illuminado spoke quite a bit for someone supposedly enlightened by the superiority of silence. Acharya Muna had dedicated 20 years of his life to what he considered the noblest art of human existence, educating young minds. He taught philosophy, mathematics, astronomy and literature at a respected school where families from all over the region sent their children to receive a quality education. He was the kind of teacher students remembered decades later. Clear, in his explanations, patient with questions, able to make complex concepts understandable through creative examples and brilliant analogies. until he discovered the transformative power of noble silence. The book explained that true wisdom comes from within, not from external words, that the greatest masters in history taught more through silent presence than through elaborate speeches, that verbal communication, however eloquent, was just superficial noise compared to the direct transmission of knowledge through contemplative stillness. Muna read this and had a revelation that would change his career and leave an entire generation of students completely lost. The next morning, he arrived at school with a new, revolutionary pedagogical methodology. If silence was superior to speech, then obviously his role as an educator was to demonstrate this superiority through completely non-verbal instruction. No more confusing lectures, no more explanations that only created dependence on external authority. Just pure transmission of wisdom through silent presence. The first opportunity to apply this new approach appeared during math class. The students were learning about proportions. Traditionally, Muna would have explained the concept, given practical examples, answered questions, and guided the students through progressive exercises. But he looked at the class of 15 young people and saw an opportunity to offer something much deeper than mere information. He sat in absolute silence and looked at the students with the serenity of someone who had discovered a profound pedagogical truth. The students waited. Muna remained silent. They waited longer. The silence deepened. After 15 minutes, a student timidly raised his hand. "Professor Muna, are you going to explain proportions today?" Muna looked at the student with infinite compassion and remained silent. Words were limitations. The truth about proportions would be transmitted directly mind to mind through contemplative stillness. After half an hour, the students began to whisper among themselves. After an hour, they were clearly restless. By the end of the 2-hour class, they were completely confused about proportions, about the teacher's sanity, and about whether they should call someone to check if Muna had suffered some kind of attack. Muna returned home radiant. He had offered the students something infinitely more valuable than verbal explanations about mathematics. He had offered them the opportunity to develop intuitive understanding through silent contemplation. The second class was literature. Instead of discussing classical poetry, Muna sat in contemplative silence and radiated appreciation for the beauty of language through non-verbal presence. The students spent 2 hours looking at a teacher who said absolutely nothing about the poems they were supposed to be studying. The third class was astronomy. Instead of explaining planetary motion, Muna silently meditated on the vastness of the cosmos and tried to transmit this feeling through contemplative waves. The students spent 2 hours wondering if they should inform their parents that their teacher had apparently lost the ability to speak. At the end of the first week of his new methodology, Muna was convinced he had revolutionized education. The students were being exposed to much deeper forms of learning than mere verbal transmission of information. They were developing contemplative abilities that would serve them for a lifetime. The students, for their part, were developing theories about what had happened to their teacher. "Maybe he took a vow of silence," said one. "Maybe he's testing our patience," said another. "Maybe he lost his voice," suggested a third. "Maybe he's gone mad," muttered a fourth, expressing what everyone was thinking but no one wanted to say. In the second week, the parents started asking questions. Their children were coming home having learned absolutely nothing in any subject. The classes consisted entirely of watching a teacher who sat in contemplative silence for hours on end. Muna interpreted these questions as evidence that his approach was challenging limited expectations about conventional education. It was exactly the kind of resistance that truly revolutionary methods always faced. "I am teaching your children about the nature of true wisdom," he explained to the concerned parents. "Real knowledge does not come from words, but from intuitive understanding developed through contemplative stillness." "But they need to learn math," said one father. "Mathematics is just a limited mental construct," Muna replied serenely. "I am offering something much more valuable, direct access to the source of all knowledge." The parents left even more worried than before. In the third week of Muna's educational experiment with silent transmission of knowledge, 3 simultaneous developments, created what future pedagogues would call systemic communicative collapse in an academic environment. First, the students had completely stopped asking questions, as questions were consistently answered with more contemplative silence. Second, they had started using class time to do homework for other subjects, as the teacher's presence seemed to be purely decorative. Third, some had started skipping classes, discovering that they could receive the same amount of instruction by staying at home. Muna observed all this and saw only evidence that his methodology was working perfectly. "Look how my students are developing intellectual independence," he told the school principal. "They no longer depend on external verbal explanations. They are learning to find knowledge within themselves." The principal looked at the classrooms where students were sleeping, talking, or simply ignoring the teacher's presence completely, and had difficulty seeing evidence of intellectual independence. "Mauna," he said carefully, "perhaps we can discuss how contemplative silence and traditional education can work together." "Traditional education is based on the illusion that knowledge can be transmitted through words," Mauna replied. "I am offering authentic education based on the awakening of innate wisdom." The first class of the day was geometry. Traditionally, the students would have been learning about angles and triangles. Instead, Muna sat in a lotus position and radiated mathematical understanding through silent waves of geometric consciousness. The students spent 2 hours playing cards, sleeping, and occasionally looking at the teacher to check if he was still breathing. One particularly creative student had started taking notes on Mauna's behavior, treating the classes as a case study in abnormal psychology. Day 15. Teacher continues in total silence, remains motionless for periods of up to 3 hours, responds to all questions with a serene gaze and no verbal communication. Possible diagnosis: psychotic break with spiritual delusions. The second class was history. Instead of discussing historical events, Muna meditated on the cyclical nature of time and tried to transmit an understanding of impermanence through contemplative presence. The students used the time to organize a betting pool on how long Muna could go without speaking. The bets ranged from 1 more week to forever. In the third period, something new happened. A student decided to test the limits of the silent methodology. "Professor Muna," he said aloud, "I'm confused about how silence teaches me math. Can you explain?" Muna looked at the student with universal love and remained silent. "I'm interpreting your silence as a no," the student continued. "So I'm going to assume that 2 + 2 = 5. Is that correct?" Contemplative silence. "Great. And I'm going to assume that the capital of France is a goldfish. Is that also correct?" More serene silence. "Perfect. And clearly, since you're not correcting anything I say, all my answers on all the exams will be automatically correct, regardless of what I write." The student had accidentally discovered a fundamental flaw in the educational system based exclusively on noble silence. Without verbal communication, there was no way to correct misunderstandings, clarify concepts, or indicate when someone was completely wrong about something important. Other students began to experiment with the same logic. "Professor," said one student, "I'm going to interpret your silence as approval to never do any homework again." "And I'm going to interpret it as permission to teach the class in your place," said another student, standing up and beginning to explain geometry completely incorrectly to the rest of the class. Muna watched a student teach wrong math to other students and experienced something that educational philosophers would call cognitive dissonance between pedagogical ideology and observable practical outcome. For the first time in 3 weeks, he considered the possibility that total silence might not be the most effective teaching method for all situations. But then he remembered the book about silent wisdom and reaffirmed his conviction that he was offering something much more valuable than mere correction of factual errors. He was teaching the students to develop inner discernment, even if that inner discernment was leading them to conclusions like 2 + 2 = goldfish and geometry works through magic. At the end of the day, he returned home more convinced than ever that he had discovered the ultimate educational methodology. The students were clearly becoming more independent, more creative, and more willing to question authority. the fact that they were also becoming dramatically less educated in any academic subject seemed to be a secondary detail. In the 5th week of Muna's pedagogical experiment, something happened that not even his most creative educational philosophy had anticipated. The final exams were approaching. For a month, the students had received 0 verbal instruction on any subject, 0 clarifications on difficult concepts, 0 corrections when they understood something completely wrong. Now they needed to demonstrate knowledge they had theoretically absorbed through silent transmission of wisdom. Muna prepared the exams with the same meticulous care he had always used. Math questions that required a clear understanding of fundamental principles, literature questions that demanded sophisticated analysis of classical texts, astronomy problems based on precise calculations of planetary motion. The difference was that now he expected the students to answer everything based exclusively on intuitive wisdom developed through silent contemplation. The first exam was math. Muna distributed the questions and sat in contemplative meditation while he watched the students work. He radiated waves of silent encouragement and confidence in their ability to access mathematical knowledge through pure intuition. The students looked at the questions about proportions, geometry, and basic algebra. Then they looked at the teacher sitting in a lotus position. Then they looked back at the questions. The first student wrote, "Based on the silent education I have received, I understand that all mathematical answers are equally valid, depending on the contemplative perspective. Therefore, the answer to all questions is silence." The second student was more creative. "For a month, I have learned through silent observation that Professor Muna believes that knowledge comes from within. Since mathematics comes from within me, I declare that 2 plus 2 equals whatever number I feel it should be at the moment." The third student applied pure logic. If silence is superior to verbal communication, then written answers are inferior to silent answers. Therefore, I am answering all questions through mental contemplation and leaving the paper intentionally blank. A particularly intelligent student wrote a detailed analysis. Based on the educational methodology we have received, I conclude that this exam is a philosophical contradiction. If true knowledge cannot be transmitted through words, then it cannot be demonstrated through written words. This exam is therefore impossible within the pedagogical system we have been offered. Muna read the answers that night and experienced something that educators throughout history know well. The moment when theory meets practical results and discovers that they are not speaking the same language. No student had answered a single math question correctly, but they had all perfectly applied the logic of the silent education he had offered for a month. The literature exam was even more revealing. The questions asked for analysis of classical poems that the students were supposed to have studied during the month. Instead, they had spent hours observing a teacher in contemplative silence. One student wrote, "All poems are expressions of the same universal truth. Therefore, all poems mean the same thing, silence. Specific analysis is unnecessary." Another answered, "True poetry transcends words. The best answer to any question about literature is not to answer, following the example of our teacher." One student offered, "For a month I have learned that verbal communication is limited. Therefore, these poems are inferior to the contemplative silence we practiced in class. There is nothing to analyze." The most creative of all wrote, "If Professor Muna can teach entire literature through silence, I can demonstrate literary understanding through silence. This blank page contains all the necessary analysis, transmitted through contemplative presence." Muna spent the night looking at piles of exams that were philosophically consistent with his educational methodology, but academically useless by any traditional standard of knowledge. For the first time since he had begun the experiment, he wondered if perhaps there was a difference between personal spiritual wisdom and practical education that prepares young people to function in the world. The next morning, he sat at his desk and looked at the book on noble silence that had inspired this whole experience. Then he looked at the exams. Then he thought about the students who depended on him to actually learn things they would need to know for their future lives. For the first time in 5 weeks, Acharya Muna considered the possibility that perhaps the Illuminado had spoken so much for a reason. The morning after the disastrous exams, Muna arrived at school to find an emergency meeting waiting for him. The principal, 3 other teachers, and a delegation of concerned parents were sitting in his classroom, surrounded by physical evidence of 5 weeks of silent education, piles of blank exams, homework that consisted entirely of empty pages with the explanation answered through silent contemplation, student notebooks where the last 5 weeks were literally blank pages. "Mauna," said the principal with the patience of someone who had spent the night awake, trying to explain the situation to furious parents, "we need to talk about the results of your experimental methodology." Muna sat down and looked at the group with the serenity of someone who had dedicated 5 weeks to transcending worldly concerns about measurable educational outcomes. "I see you are attached to conventional ways of measuring academic progress," he said calmly. "I am offering something much deeper than superficial knowledge transmitted through words." A father stood up with an exam in his hand. "Professor Muna, my son wrote that 2 plus 2 equals whatever he feels at the moment. He is taking university entrance exams next year. Universities generally expect students to know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is just a limited social convention," Muna replied. "I am teaching your son to transcend mathematical limitations through intuitive understanding." "Intuitive understanding won't help him pass math exams," said the father. "Math exams are based on primitive dualistic thinking," Mona explained. "I am preparing your son for much higher forms of knowledge." A mother showed her daughter's notebook. 5 weeks of completely blank pages, not a single note on literature, history, or any subject. How is my daughter going to learn anything? "Your daughter is learning the most important lesson of all," said Muna. "That true knowledge does not come from books or words, but from contemplative silence. She needs knowledge that will help her function in the real world," the mother insisted. "The real world is an illusion," Muna replied serenely. "I am preparing your daughter for true reality." The principal tried a diplomatic approach. "Muna, I respect your search for innovative educational methods, but perhaps we can find ways to incorporate contemplative wisdom alongside traditional instruction, not in place of traditional instruction. Traditional instruction corrupts the purity of silent transmission," said Muna. "I cannot dilute authentic methods with concessions to limited expectations." It was at that moment that one of the older students entered the room. He had heard about the meeting and had come to share his perspective on the educational experience of the past 5 weeks. "Professor Muna," the student said respectfully, "may I ask a question?" Muna nodded graciously. "For 5 weeks, you have taught us through silence, but now you are explaining your educational philosophy using many words. If silence is superior to verbal communication, why are you talking to us instead of simply radiating understanding through contemplative presence?" The question created a silence in the room that had nothing to do with spiritual contemplation. Mona looked at the student and realized he had been caught in a fundamental contradiction. He was verbally defending the superiority of non-verbal teaching. He was using exactly the kind of communication he had declared to be inferior to explain why he shouldn't use communication. Well, he began, then stopped. The student continued gently. "And another question. If true understanding comes from within through silent intuition, how did you learn about silent education? Did someone teach you or did you discover it on your own?" "I read about it in a book," Muna admitted. "So you learned through written words, through exactly the kind of knowledge transmission that you have. Spent 5 weeks telling us is inferior." The logic was relentless and clear. "And one last question," the student continued. "If you can learn important things through books and explanations, why can't we learn math, literature, and science through books and explanations?" Mona sat in silence. Not contemplative silence. The silence of someone who has just realized that he has built an entire educational philosophy based on principles that he himself did not follow. The principal seized the moment. "Mona, what do you think about returning to teaching methods that actually prepare students for their future lives? You can incorporate moments of silent reflection, but within a curriculum that also offers practical knowledge." Mona looked around the room. He saw parents worried about their children's future. He saw students who needed to actually learn useful things. He saw blank exams that represented 5 weeks of lost educational opportunities. For the first time since he had started the experiment, he wondered if perhaps real wisdom included knowing when to speak and when to be silent, instead of exclusively choosing one option. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "I have confused deep silence with useful silence." 3 months after his experience with purely silent education, Mona had developed what he discreetly called the pedagogy of appropriate silence. It was an approach that probably wouldn't be accepted in meditation retreats, but it worked surprisingly well for actually educating young people about mathematics, literature, and science. The first lesson had been painful, but clear. There are times for contemplative silence and times for clear verbal explanation, and confusing the two serves both purposes poorly. This meant that he still incorporated periods of silent reflection into his classes, but now, after he had clearly explained the concepts the students were supposed to contemplate, it meant that he valued intuition and inner understanding, but within the context of solid factual knowledge that gave substance to intuition. The second lesson had been even more specific. Authentic wisdom includes knowing how to communicate effectively when communication is necessary. He discovered that some of the deepest insights emerged during discussions where students could ask questions, share confusions, and work through difficult concepts aloud. Contemplative silence had its place, but so did intelligent conversation and careful explanation. The third lesson had completely changed his understanding of knowledge transmission. The best learning moments often happened when silence and communication worked together, not when one excluded the other. The real test of the new approach came when the students had to retake the exams they had failed during his purely silent period. For mathematics, Mona first explained concepts clearly, answered questions, worked through examples, and then offered periods of contemplative silence where the students could internalize what they had learned. "Now that you understand the principles," he said, "spend a few minutes in silent reflection on how these concepts connect with your intuitive understanding of numbers." It was silence with a purpose, based on a solid foundation of real knowledge. For literature, he first discussed the poems in detail, exploring meanings, historical context, and poetic techniques. Then he offered moments of contemplative silence, where the students could absorb the beauty and depth of what they had studied. "Now that you know the context and the techniques," he said, "allow the poems to speak directly to your hearts through contemplative reading." It was informed contemplation, not contemplation based on ignorance of what was being contemplated. The results were revealing. The students not only performed much better on the exams, but they also demonstrated the kind of deep understanding and genuine appreciation that Mona had hoped to develop through purely silent methods. Even more interesting, they began to ask more sophisticated questions and have more creative insights when they had both factual knowledge and contemplative space to process that knowledge. "Professor Mona," said one student after a class on astronomy, "when you explained planetary motion and then gave us time to contemplate the vastness of the cosmos, I understood both the mathematics and the beauty of the universe. When it was just silence, I understood neither." One day, a visiting professor came to observe his classes. The man had heard about Mona's pedagogical experiment and was curious about his current methods. "I understand you experimented with education based exclusively on silence," said the visitor. "Yes," said Mona, "and I learned some valuable lessons about when silence is useful and when it is not." "And what were those lessons?" "That silence without knowledge is just silent confusion. That contemplation without understanding is just time wasted in stillness. That real wisdom includes knowing how to communicate clearly when communication serves learning." "And do you still value contemplative silence?" "More than before, actually, but now I understand that truly deep silence is different from silence that avoids the responsibility of teaching clearly." The visiting professor observed a class where Mona explained complex mathematical concepts with crystal clarity, answered questions patiently, worked through problems step by step, and then offered 15 minutes of silent reflection where the students internalized and integrated what they had learned. "It's an interesting approach," said the visitor. "You've managed to combine academic rigor with contemplative depth." "I've discovered that they support each other rather than compete," said Muna. "Solid knowledge makes contemplation more meaningful. Deep contemplation makes knowledge more integrated." That night, Mauna reread the book on noble silence that had inspired his original experience. On the second reading, he noticed phrases he had ignored the first time. Appropriate silence at the appropriate time. Wisdom includes knowing when to speak and when to be silent. Skillful means adapt the method to what best serves learning. Apparently, total silence was not exactly what the book was recommending. Perhaps, he said to himself, the most important lesson about silence is knowing when to break it. And while Mauna was finally discovering that wisdom includes knowing when to break the silence, in the distant mountains of Thailand, an even more peculiar discovery about Buddhist non-interference was about to reveal why some spiritual principles work better in theory than on the operating table. Because it turns out that every era produces practitioners convinced they have found the perfect application of non-attachment to professional life. And every era discovers, through patients increasingly concerned about their survival, that there are moments in medical practice when non-action and medical negligence are dangerously precise synonyms. In a rural clinic, a doctor was about to conduct one of the most silently risky experiments in the history of medicine, an experiment that would demonstrate with clinical precision why the Illuminado never opened a hospital. Fra Mo Sophon had dedicated 15 years of his life to what he considered the noblest art of human existence, healing the suffering of others. He worked in a rural clinic in the mountains of northern Thailand, where families from distant villages came to seek treatment for ailments ranging from simple fevers to emergencies that challenged his basic medical training. He was the kind of doctor that patients remembered with gratitude, careful in his diagnosis, dedicated in his treatment, able to work with limited resources to solve complex problems. His reputation had spread for miles of mountain trails until he discovered the transformative power of total medical non-attachment. The book explained that true wisdom comes from a serenity that is not agitated by results, not from constant anxiety about outcomes, that the universe was already managing perfectly, that the greatest sages in history healed more through serene presence than through anxious interventions, that modern medicine, however advanced, was just unnecessary interference compared to the body's natural healing ability when left in perfect equanimity. Mo Sophon read this and had a revelation that would change his medical practice and leave an entire generation of patients completely confused about what had happened to their doctor. The next morning, he arrived at the clinic with a new, revolutionary therapeutic methodology. If true non-attachment was superior to medical anxiety, then, obviously, his role as a healer was to demonstrate this superiority through completely detached medicine. No more anxious prescriptions that only created dependence on external interventions. No more procedures driven by attachment to specific results. Just serene presence allowing the body's natural wisdom to run its course without emotional interference. The first opportunity to apply this new approach appeared when a woman arrived with a 3-year-old child in a febrile state. Traditionally, Mo Sophon would have examined the child, identified possible causes of the fever, prescribed appropriate medication, and guided specific care. But he looked at the desperate mother and saw an opportunity to offer something much deeper than mere intervention driven by anxiety. He sat in absolute non-attachment and observed the child with the serenity of someone who had discovered a profound medical truth. The mother waited. Mo Sophon continued in contemplative indifference. She waited longer. The impartial serenity deepened. After 20 minutes, the woman timidly asked, "Dr. Mo, are you going to examine my daughter?" Mo Sophon looked at the woman with infinite compassion and continued in perfect non-attachment. Interventions were manifestations of anxious attachment to specific results. True healing would emerge spontaneously through serene non-interference. After an hour, the child was clearly getting worse. After 2 hours, the mother was desperate. At the end of the consultation that would traditionally last 15 minutes, the family left completely confused about medicine, about Buddhism, and about whether they should seek another doctor immediately. Mo Sofon returned home radiant. He had offered the family something infinitely more valuable than treatments driven by anxiety about results. He had offered them the opportunity to trust in the body's natural wisdom through completely detached presence. The second patient was a farmer with an infected wound on his hand. Instead of cleaning, disinfecting, and prescribing antibiotics, Mo Sofon silently meditated on the body's natural ability to fight infection when not disturbed by interventions based on attachment to specific outcomes. The farmer spent 2 hours observing a doctor who did not touch, did not examine, and prescribed absolutely nothing for an infection that was visibly spreading. The third case was an elderly woman with chest pains. Instead of checking vital signs and considering heart problems, Mo Sofon practiced impartial serenity about the self-balancing nature of bodily systems when free from anxious medical interference. The woman spent 2 hours wondering if she should inform her family that the local doctor had apparently lost the ability to practice medicine. At the end of the first week of his new methodology, Mo Sofon was convinced he had revolutionized the art of healing. Patients were being exposed to much deeper forms of treatment than mere prescription based on attachment to results. They were developing confidence in the natural wisdom of their own bodies that would serve them for a lifetime. The patients, for their part, were developing theories about what had happened to their doctor. Maybe he had a breakdown, said one. Maybe it's a new Eastern medicine technique, said another. Maybe he lost his license and doesn't want to admit it, suggested a third. Maybe he's lost his mind, muttered a fourth, expressing what everyone was thinking but no one wanted to say. In the second week, families began to travel even greater distances to get to the nearest clinic. Their relatives were coming home having received absolutely no treatment for any medical condition. The consultations consisted entirely of observing a doctor who sat in contemplative non-attachment while completely ignoring symptoms that required immediate attention. Mo Sofon interpreted this migration of patients as evidence that his approach was challenging limited expectations about conventional medicine. It was exactly the kind of resistance that truly revolutionary methods always faced. In the third week of Mo Sofon's experiment with completely detached medicine, 3 simultaneous developments created what future epidemiologists would call a public health crisis induced by philosophical misinterpretation. First, several treatable conditions had become serious because they did not receive basic medical attention. Second, the clinic's reputation had changed from a reliable place for medical care to a place where the doctor meditates while you die. Third, some people were genuinely getting better, creating a confusing situation where total non-attachment worked in 15% of cases and failed dramatically in the other 85%. Mo Sofon observed all this and saw only evidence that his methodology was completely transcending the limitations of conventional medicine. "Look how my non-attachment has created space for natural healing," he told the clinic assistant, a young man who had started keeping secret records of patients who needed to be urgently referred to other doctors. "We are practicing medicine as the Illuminado would have practiced it." The assistant looked at the records, which showed a 400% increase in preventable medical complications and had difficulty seeing evidence of Buddhist wisdom. "Doctor Mo," he said carefully, "perhaps we can practice non-attachment in a way that doesn't involve patients with cardiac emergencies waiting 2 hours for care. Cardiac emergencies are just perceptions based on attachment to bodily continuity," Mo Sofon replied serenely. "I am teaching our patients about impermanence through the direct experience of cardiovascular systems in transition." The first patient of the day was a woman who had developed a sophisticated understanding of Mo Sofon's new medical philosophy. She arrived feigning severe symptoms and then offered to pay extra for a consultation with traditional intervention. "Doctor," she said dramatically, "I have terrible pain in my abdomen, but if you apply your detached medicine, I can pay double for a few minutes of, how can I put it, old-school medical attention." Mo Sofon examined the woman's performance and applied his detached logic. Pain is just resistance to the present experience. I accept your offer of extra payment for the privilege of practicing premium non-interference with your abdominal situation. The woman left with a perfectly healthy stomach and a significantly lighter wallet. Mo Sofon kept the money as evidence that medical non-attachment had market value. The second client was even more creative. He had heard about Mo Sofon's non-interventionist approach and brought an innovative business proposal. "Doctor," he said, "I would like to hire your medical non-attachment services for my entire family for a year. Payment in advance, obviously." "Preventive medical non-attachment?" asked Mo Sofon. "Exactly. You don't treat anyone in my family for 12 months, no matter what happens. It's a perfect system. You practice systematic non-interference. I practice not spending money on medicine." Mo Sofon was impressed by the man's spiritual innovation. "You are offering to hire me to do nothing in a consistent and predictable way. This is non-attachment in its purest form. I accept your proposal." The man paid a ridiculously low amount and left with rights to medical non-treatment that had not even been requested yet. In the third case, an entire family arrived with an approach they called reverse medicine. They explained that they were too healthy to need medical treatment, but that they would be willing to accept free consultations in exchange for not burdening the local health system. "You are offering perfect health in exchange for unnecessary consultations," said Mo Sofon with tears of admiration. "This is an enlightened transaction." The family left with guaranteed monthly consultations for conditions they did not have, creating a system where healthy people received preventive non-treatment. Meanwhile, in the local community, the situation was developing in directions that public health experts would call systematic collapse disguised as applied spirituality. 3 people had been hospitalized in neighboring towns with conditions that could have been easily treated if they had received basic medical attention in the first week of symptoms. An elderly woman had spent 4 days with pneumonia, while Mo Sofon meditated on the impermanent nature of respiratory systems. But the most disturbing aspect of the situation was that some people were genuinely feeling better after the detached consultations. A local merchant came to thank him personally. "Dr. Mo," he said, "your approach cured my chronic health anxiety. I spent 2 hours watching you do absolutely nothing about my imaginary symptoms, and I realized that I was creating problems that didn't exist." "You experienced healing through the recognition of the illusory nature of suffering," replied Mo Sofon. "This is authentic medicine." "But what about cases where people have real problems that need real treatment?" asked the merchant. "Real problems are a mental category based on attachment to narratives about what constitutes a medical emergency," explained Mo Sofon. "I am offering freedom from these conceptual limitations." The merchant left convinced that he had experienced something profound, but beginning to wonder about the difference between spiritual enlightenment and systematic medical negligence. That night, the clinic assistant presented Mo Sofon with a list of statistics he had been secretly compiling. "Doctor," he said respectfully, "I have data on the results of our new approach." The statistics that the assistant had compiled created what medical ethics experts would call a quantified dilemma between spiritual philosophy and measurable results. In 3 weeks, the clinic had seen 127 patients using the total non-attachment methodology. The results were educational in a way that no Buddhist text had prepared Mo Sofon to interpret. 19 patients with psychosomatic conditions had improved dramatically after realizing that their symptoms were manifestations of health anxiety. 23 patients with colds and self-limiting conditions had recovered naturally in the expected time, creating the impression that medical non-attachment worked perfectly. But 85 patients with conditions that required basic intervention had worsened in predictable and preventable ways. "Dr. Mo," the assistant said carefully, "we have a 33% improvement rate when we include cases that would have improved on their own. But we have a 67% rate of preventable complications in cases that would traditionally respond well to basic treatment." Mo Sofon studied the numbers and applied his detached interpretation. "Numbers are just mental concepts based on attachment to quantifiable results. I am offering healing that transcends statistics. But 3 people were hospitalized with conditions that could have been treated here at the first consultation, insisted the assistant. Hospitalization is an opportunity for them to practice non-attachment in a controlled environment, explained Mo Sofon. I am providing advanced lessons on impermanence through direct medical experience. It was at that moment that something happened that would test the limits of detached medicine. A woman arrived carrying a 2-year-old child who had been bitten by a venomous snake. The child was clearly in shock, with unstable vital signs and progressive neurological symptoms. It was the kind of emergency that required immediate action, a specific antidote and intensive care. Mo Sofon looked at the situation and faced his first real test of non-attachment in the face of a genuine emergency. The mother was hysterical. "Doctor, please, my daughter was bitten by a snake an hour ago. She's very sick." Mo Sofon felt something that practitioners of misapplied non-attachment know well. The moment when philosophy meets urgent physical reality and discovers that they do not speak the same language. For a second, 15 years of medical training screamed at him to act immediately. For another second, 3 weeks of practicing total non-attachment whispered to him to maintain impartial serenity in the face of natural impermanence. He chose a middle ground that satisfied neither medicine nor Buddhism. "I will apply compassionate non-attachment to your daughter's situation," he said, and began to meditate on the transient nature of life, while occasionally checking the child's vital signs. It was enough non-attachment to not properly treat the emergency, but enough intervention to create anxiety about not being fully detached. The result was the worst possible version of both approaches. 40 minutes later, when it became clear that compassionate meditation does not neutralize snake venom, the assistant made a decision that would save the child's life and Mo Sofon's career. "Doctor," he said firmly, "I am going to prepare the antidote and initiate the emergency protocol. You can continue practicing non-attachment while I practice medicine." Mo Sofon watched the assistant act with urgent competence to save a life, and experienced something that Buddhist philosophers would call a sudden awakening about the difference between wise non-attachment and indifference disguised as spirituality. While the assistant administered treatment that effectively saved the child, Mo Sofon had his first real doubt about detached medicine. Perhaps, he thought, watching the child stabilize under competent medical care, there are times when authentic compassion requires specific action, not impartial serenity. 3 hours later, when the child was stable and the family had been transferred to a better-equipped hospital, Mo Sofon sat alone in the empty clinic. For the first time in 3 weeks, he truly looked at the practical result of his medical philosophy. People with real problems had left without real help. People with emergencies had received meditation instead of medicine. A child had almost died because he had confused spiritual non-attachment with abandonment of professional responsibility. He picked up the book on non-attachment that had inspired this whole experience and reread it carefully. On the second reading, he noticed sentences he had ignored the first time. Non-attachment does not mean indifference to the needs of others. Compassion requires skillful action when action is necessary. True non-attachment includes total commitment to the well-being of others. Apparently, total non-attachment to medical responsibility was not exactly what the book was recommending. Mo Sofon spent the rest of the night reviewing cases from the past 3 weeks, calculating how many complications could have been avoided, how many people had suffered unnecessarily, and how long it would take to restore the community's trust in the clinic. When the assistant arrived the next morning, he found Mo Sofon sitting at his desk, surrounded by medical books, and with an expression he hadn't seen in a long time. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the difference between wise non-attachment and negligence disguised as Buddhist philosophy." The morning after the snakebite incident, Mo Sofon arrived at the clinic and found a situation that had developed overnight. 3 community elders, the local traditional healer, and the clinic assistant were waiting for him, surrounded by physical evidence of 3 weeks of detached medicine. Piles of documented cases where simple conditions had become complicated, records of emergency transfers that could have been avoided, testimonies from families who had traveled impossible distances to find real medical treatment after consultations that consisted entirely of contemplative observation. Mo Sofon, said the most respected elder with the patience of someone who had spent the night awake trying to understand the situation, "We need to talk about the results of your experimental methodology." Mo Sofon sat down and looked at the group with the serenity of someone who had dedicated 3 weeks to transcending worldly concerns about measurable medical results. "I see you are attached to conventional ways of measuring therapeutic success," he said calmly. "I am offering something much deeper than superficial medicine based on symptomatic interventions." The traditional healer stood up with a set of medicinal herbs in his hand. "Mo Sofon," he said respectfully, "I have been treating people with plants and ceremonies for 40 years. I have never lost a child to a snake bite, because I know that some situations require immediate action, not meditation. Immediate action is just a response based on attachment to bodily continuity," replied Mo Sofon. "I am teaching our community to transcend limitations on what constitutes a medical emergency." "Teaching transcendence will not help a child with venom in their system," said the healer. "Venom in the system is just a perspective based on dualistic concepts about toxins," explained Mo Sofon. "I am offering freedom from these limited categories." The clinic assistant tried a diplomatic approach. "Dr. Mo, I respect your search for innovative medical methods, but perhaps we can find ways to incorporate Buddhist wisdom alongside medical intervention when necessary, not in place of medical intervention." "Medical intervention corrupts the purity of natural healing," said Mo Sofon. "I cannot dilute authentic methods with concessions to limited expectations about treatment." It was at that moment that one of the oldest women in the community entered the room. She had walked for 3 hours to get to the clinic and was accompanied by 2 granddaughters who were clearly ill. "Dr. Mo," she said directly, "my granddaughters have had a fever for 5 days. I need you to examine them and tell me what to do." Mo Sofon looked at the feverish children and experienced something that doctors in a vocational crisis know well. The moment when personal philosophy collides with professional responsibility, and a choice must be made immediately. The children clearly needed medical attention. A physical exam, a differential diagnosis, possibly medication. It was basic medicine that he had practiced, competently for 15 years. But 3 weeks of total non-attachment had created a professional identity based on not doing exactly that. He tried a middle ground that satisfied neither medicine nor Buddhism. "I will apply compassionate non-attachment balanced with minimal medical attention," he said, and began to examine the children while meditating on the impermanent nature of symptoms. It was enough medicine to diagnose bacterial infections that required antibiotics, but enough non-attachment to question whether prescribing treatment was unnecessary interference in natural processes. The result was 20 minutes of medical indecision while 2 sick children waited for care that their doctor was philosophically conflicted about providing. The elderly woman watched this performance and said something that would permanently change Mo Sofon's perspective on detached medicine. "Doctor," she said with the authority of someone who had raised 8 children, "if my husband tried to fix our roof while meditating on the impermanence of houses, we would die in the next rain. Some things need to be done well, not philosophized about." The analogy was so precise that Mo Sofon stopped in the middle of a contemplation about antibiotics and truly looked at the children for the first time in weeks. They were sick. They needed medicine. He was a doctor. The math was simple. "You have infections that respond well to antibiotics," he said, and the words felt strange after 3 weeks of contemplative communication. "I will prescribe treatment, and you should get better in a few days." The woman smiled. "Thank you, doctor. That's what I needed to know." As she left with clear prescriptions and specific instructions, Mo Sofon realized something fundamental that he had missed during his experiment with total non-attachment. Competent medicine and Buddhist wisdom were not opposites. Taking good care of sick people could be a more authentic expression of compassion than meditating on the illusory nature of illness. That afternoon, he met again with the community elders. "I've been thinking," he said, about the difference between non-attachment that liberates and indifference that abandons responsibility. "And what is the difference?" asked the elder. "I'm still figuring it out," said Mo Sofon, "but I think it has something to do with being a competent doctor who doesn't anxiously cling to results, rather than being a serene non-doctor who completely abandons the role of a healer." The traditional healer nodded. "I have been treating people for 40 years without clinging to every outcome, but I never fail to do my best work because of it." "Perhaps," said Mo Sofon, "that is a more important lesson about applied Buddhism than anything I read in that book." 6 months after his experience with total medical non-attachment, Mo Sofon had developed what he discreetly called practical Buddhist medicine. It was an approach that probably wouldn't be accepted in monasteries, but it worked surprisingly well for actually healing people through competent medical care. The first lesson had been painful, but clear. There are times for contemplative serenity and times for precise medical action, and confusing the two serves both purposes poorly. This meant that he still incorporated moments of contemplative reflection into his practice, but now, after he had properly diagnosed and treated the conditions that the patients actually had, it meant that he valued non-attachment to results and non-anxiety about outcomes, but within the context of solid medical competence that gave substance to the non-attachment. The second lesson had been even more specific. Authentic Buddhist wisdom includes knowing how to act effectively when action is necessary. He discovered that some of the deepest insights about impermanence emerged during conversations where patients could ask questions about their diagnoses, share concerns about treatments, and work through medical anxieties in open discussion. Contemplative silence had its place, but so did clear communication and direct medical care. The third lesson had completely changed his understanding of medical compassion. The best moments of healing often happened when technical competence and contemplative wisdom worked together, not when one excluded the other. The real test of the new approach came when a situation almost identical to the snakebite incident presented itself again. A family arrived with a child who had suffered a severe allergic reaction. The child was in anaphylactic shock, with difficulty breathing and unstable vital signs. It was exactly the kind of emergency that had almost resulted in tragedy during his period of total non-attachment. This time, Mo Sofon acted immediately. He administered epinephrine, established an airway, started intravenous fluids, and stabilized the child with the competence of 15 years of medical training. Only after the emergency was controlled, when the child was stable and the family was visibly relieved, did he offer the kind of contemplative reflection that he had learned to integrate properly. "Now that your daughter is out of danger," he said to the parents, "we can talk about how experiences like this teach us about the precious and fragile nature of life, and how that can help us to value every moment we have together." It was contemplation based on medical safety, not contemplation instead of medical safety. For chronic conditions, he first established clear diagnoses and effective treatment plans. Then he offered perspectives on how to live well with conditions that could not be completely cured, how to find peace even when the body was not functioning perfectly, and how to develop acceptance without abandoning appropriate care. "Now that we understand your condition and have a treatment plan," he would say, "we can explore how to accept physical limitations without accepting unnecessary suffering about those limitations." It was the integration of wisdom within competent medicine, not wisdom in place of competent medicine. The results were revealing. Patients not only had much better medical outcomes, but they also demonstrated the kind of serene acceptance and wise perspective that Mo Sofon had hoped to develop through purely contemplative methods. Even more interesting, they began to ask more sophisticated questions about how to live well with their conditions and to have deeper insights about impermanence when they had both adequate medical care and contemplative space to process their health experiences. "Dr. Mo," said a patient with diabetes after a consultation where he had received both medication adjustments and guidance on accepting chronic conditions, "when you took care of my medical condition and then talked about how to live in peace with it, I understood both the treatment and the wisdom. When it was just contemplation, I understood neither medicine nor Buddhism." One day, a young doctor from an urban clinic came to observe Mo Sofon's methods. The young man had heard about Mo Sophon's Buddhist approach and was curious about integrating spirituality with medicine. "I understand you experimented with medicine based exclusively on non-attachment," said the visitor. "Yes," said Mo Sophon. "And I learned some valuable lessons about when non-attachment is useful and when it is not." "And what were those lessons?" "That non-attachment without competence is just contemplative negligence. That wisdom without medical skill is just philosophy that doesn't help sick people. That real Buddhism includes knowing how to act skillfully when action serves the well-being of others." "And do you still value non-attachment in medicine?" "More than before, actually. But now I understand that truly deep non-attachment is different from indifference that avoids the responsibility of competently caring for people who need medical help." The visiting doctor observed a consultation where Mo Sophon treated a respiratory infection with clear medical competence, answered technical questions patiently, and then offered 10 minutes of conversation about how illness can teach us to take better care of our bodies without excessive anxiety about perfect health. "It's an interesting approach," said the visitor. "You've managed to combine medical rigor with contemplative depth. I've discovered that they support each other rather than compete," said Mo Sophon. "Competent medicine makes contemplation more meaningful because people trust that their practical needs are being met. Deep contemplation makes medicine more humane because it treats the whole person, not just the condition." That night, Mo Sophon reread the book on non-attachment that had inspired his original experience. On the second reading, he noticed phrases he had ignored the first time. Non-attachment at the appropriate time for the appropriate purpose. Wisdom includes knowing when to act and when to refrain from action. Compassion uses skillful means that truly benefit others. Apparently, total non-attachment to medical responsibility was not exactly what the book was recommending. Perhaps, he said to himself, the most important lesson about non-attachment is knowing when to apply it and when to apply dedicated competence. And so we discover that the human search for wisdom always follows the same pattern. We find profound principles. We apply these principles in extreme ways, and we discover that real wisdom is more subtle than any perfect formula. The truth that connects all these experiences is simple. Wisdom is not found in rules that always work. Wisdom is knowing what each specific moment needs from us. Sometimes we need to be firm. Sometimes we need to let go. Sometimes we need to speak. Sometimes we need to act. The art is in discerning which response best serves real well-being. Perhaps the Illuminado was not trying to make us perfect. Perhaps he was trying to make us wise. And wisdom works very well with human nature exactly as it is. If you enjoyed this journey through the absurdities of the spiritual search, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories that reveal universal truths through unlikely humor. Turn on the bell and share in the comments your own experience with spiritual extremes. Good night, sleep well, and remember, enlightenment that always works includes the ability to laugh at yourself.